Let's see. Are they okay? مساء الخير عليكم جميعا. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to Oriental Hall once again here at the American University in Cairo in the Tahrir campus. We are gathering this evening for several reasons. Frankly, best way to describe it, it's a celebratory discussion. I say this because we have many reasons to celebrate this particular evening, and we have a lot of topics to discuss. I nevertheless will only focus on a few points, and then we can start the dialogue more substantively. This session of the Tahrir Dialogue is our 100th in a series that started almost a decade ago. It's a reflection of the serious commitment that the American University in Cairo has to raising issues of public concern, to engaging the general public, and to doing so at a high quality with not only interesting topics, but also with very distinguished panelists and speakers. Needless to say, while we started off back in 2011 with face-to-face events, first in Ewart, then here, we were a bit forced to cramp down a little bit and to look for ways to continue to have the dialogue electronically because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I do, however, believe that the continuation of the dialogue for so many different events and with such a diverse set of topics does reflect that there is an insatiable appetite for serious, considered dialogue about important issues of the common good. A dialogue that does not necessarily involve academics or practitioners alone, but includes them. And it is particularly unique for the Tahrir Dialogue that this is a public dialogue. So it's a reflection that the public really wants to engage in a serious consideration of these issues. I'd also venture to add that I believe holding this number of dialogues is a reflection of the resiliency and productivity of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo, that with a brief break in the series because of COVID, we continued to hold the dialogues moving online and then moving back to a hybrid formula. This evening, again, has some face-to-face participants in your presence, but it also is online, and there are other participants following on Zoom. In other words, we are committed to continuing this discussion, irrespective of obstacles or difficulties that may exist. It's, in many ways, I suppose, a fateful coincidence that while we're celebrating 100 sessions in the Tahrir Dialogue, the occasion today is actually about celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Cairo Review on Global Affairs. The Cairo Review on Global Affairs is the only English language quarterly of its nature in the Arab world. And the genesis of the Cairo Review was our sense that it is important to bring issues of global affairs to the Egyptian and Middle Eastern audience. And also it's important to ensure that those around the world interested in this topic listen to an Arab voice. And frankly, we could think of no better place to do that than Cairo, and particularly from the American University in Cairo, given its track record on these issues and its ability to access the international community. As always, we only hold these dialogues, and we have been very careful in our contributors to the Cairo Review. We really only choose top quality contributors and panelists. And this is no exception. We have with us today Lisa Anderson, special lecturer and the James T. Shotwell Professor of International Relations. But Dr. Anderson is also the former provost and president of AUC, and the real, if you want, the real idea of creating this school came from Lisa, and I really want to thank her for doing that. Also with us is Ibrahimov, professor of global affairs and the director of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the School of Global Affairs. He comes with both academic and professional experiences, and I'm sure you're going to find his comments quite insightful. On my left is Karim Haggag, professor and director of the Middle East Studies program at the School of Global Affairs. He's also the co-managing editor of the Cairo Review, so I'm sure he's quite proud of being able to celebrate its 10th anniversary. Excuse me. Before inviting the panelists to make a few comments, and I will ultimately, not quickly, but ultimately hand it over to Karim to manage the session, I do want to express my sincere appreciation to the staff of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Our main stakeholders are, of course, students, and the backbone of the university is its faculty. But I really believe that the staff help cement the process together. They ensure that faculty are able to function properly, and they ensure that the students are able to be serviced at the highest level. So it's a joint comprehensive event, and I think we don't frequently enough thank the faculty. I wanted to seize this occasion to do that because over the last 48 hours with this event, the faculty of the school has been hosting 5 different events on 2 campuses in 48 hours. And I think that's something exceptional, but it's something that I've gotten used to in my tenure here as dean. The faculty of the school has been consistently exceptional in its performance, and they deserve a word of thanks from us all. As I said earlier, we're here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Cairo Review. And I want to, again, convey to its editorial staff, those working with the Cairo Review and those who have contributed to it, my appreciation for the exceptional effort that they've made throughout the 10 years. This is a reflection. This is clearly reflected in the kind of interest that's shown internationally for the review itself. It is extremely well cited for a quarterly that is issued by a school at a university, well away from the international community, or at least in the Middle East rather than in the global community. The objective, as I said previously, was to bring global issues to us and bring our voices to the international community. And I think we've succeeded in that respect. Anybody who has followed the review will clearly sense that our contributors are very diverse, international and local, that our topics are also numerous and deal with many different issues. I have to admit that this past decade has been a decade of transformative events globally and regionally, and consequently we had a lot of food for thought about what's happening and a lot of issues that we could easily address. Many questions have been raised. Is the world order, the post-World War II world order, still relevant today? Is the nation-state system still relevant today? What are the effects of globalization, both in the developed and developing world? What was and what has been and what will be the transformative process in the Middle East, and that's something which we're going to discuss in a few minutes even more. So whether we're following global events or regional events, there really was quite a bit to discuss. And the Cairo Review has not shied away from any of them. It's addressed evolution, revolution, climate change, arms control, Cold War politics, Middle East politics. We've had a very candid engagement on evaluating peace processes, peace agreements. I will not shy away from saying I'm very proud of this process. I'm very proud of what we've been able to do with the Cairo Review, and I'm really confident that it will remain a enlightening contribution to the thought process, be that internationally or globally. Let me stop with those comments and hand over to Karim. He's been extremely patient, and I know he likes to manage and control events, so I'll hand it over to him to start the discussion, and then I'll re-engage on the topic itself when my turn comes. Thank you. Thank you, Karim.
Thank you, Dean Fahmy, and allow me to extend my word of welcome to all of our participants for tonight's discussion, both those of you who are present with us face-to-face in this hall, and those of you who are joining us online. So as Dean Fahmy mentioned, the occasion for tonight's Tahrir dialogue is the 10th anniversary of the Cairo Review. And you will see that for this occasion, we have issued a special commemorative issue marking the 10th anniversary of our publication under what we hope to be an interesting and catchy title of The Middle East After a Turbulent Decade, What Next? So we pose the question as the title of our special 10th anniversary issue. Now, what we tried to do with this issue was something a little bit different than what we've been doing for the Cairo Review. We actually went back to the very first issue that was published in the spring of 2011. And we went back to the themes that we covered in that first issue. And looking at this first issue, it really is a reflection of how much the region has changed over the course of the last 10 years. The first issue addressed topics such as the future of the Arab revolutions, the trajectory of political Islam, the nature of regional politics in the context of the Arab uprisings, the situation with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, taking a snapshot of where the conflict was 10 years ago, among other issues. And for the 10th anniversary issue, we asked our authors to reflect on those themes and look back over the last 10 years to assess what has changed, what has not changed, and why the changes that have taken place have occurred. So we actually asked them to look backwards and reflect, but we also asked them to look forward and give us their best sense of where the region might be given the changes and trends that they have analyzed over the last 10 years. So the 10th anniversary issue is an attempt to both reflect backwards, but also to project forwards and to ask where the region is going. And to do that, we have assembled what I think is a very insightful list of authors that have addressed the issues of changing politics in the region, the trajectory of religion and religious discourse in the Middle East over the course of the last decade. We've also have a very interesting piece on regional conflicts and how the conflict environment in the region has changed. There are new issues, of course, that have emerged since the publication of our first issue. So we address the issue of climate change and resource scarcity in the Middle East, and that's also a very important theme of our issue. We also address the issue of regionalism and regional identity and how that has changed over the course of the last decade. And so this is, I think, a very interesting look about where the region was over the course of the last 10 years and where it might end up in the near term, given these changes. So that is very much the subject of our discussion this evening. What comes next after this turbulent decade for the Middle East? And to address that question, we have, I think, a very capable panel of speakers to give their reflections and thoughts on this question. Dean Fahmy has introduced our panelists, so he has relieved me of that burden. But let me just say that both Dr. Anderson and Dr. Ibrahimov have themselves contributed essays to our 10th anniversary issue, which I think you would find to be very interesting reading. Dr. Awad has penned a very interesting essay on regionalism and regional identity. And Dr. Anderson has authored an essay on the changing political discourse and political agendas of Arab states over the course of the last decade. So to address that question, I will ask our panelists to give us their thoughts in 10 minutes as to how best to approach this question. What has changed over the course of the last 10 years and what might change in the near future? And if I could call on Dr. Anderson first to give us her comments.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do this from the podium because I'm more comfortable flipping through my pages that way. But I'd like to start first by congratulating Dean Fahmy and all of the people who have been involved in producing the Tahrir dialogues and particularly the Cairo Review. I was here at the beginning of the Cairo Review, and in fact, Dean Fahmy and I had a little debate about whether this would be likely to succeed, and I think it is fair to say it has succeeded well beyond anyone's expectations. So congratulations. It is clearly an influential and widely read journal, and I think that's a credit to the school and to the dean. So let me say a few words about my own contribution to this volume and my thinking about where we've been and where we're likely to be going in this region. First, I'd like to just point out that, you know, our assignment was 10 years back and perhaps 10 years forward. And of course, I went about 70 years back, but I'm not going to be going 70 years forward, I think. But I do think it's important to really look back and try and see some historic themes in the way politics in the Arab world has developed. In fact, often we see this as a region that is where there's lots of rivalry and struggle and competition for influence, but the rules don't change. And I want to argue that the rules have changed and that they are changing again. And so the way we characterize politics in the future is unlikely to be the way we have in the recent and indeed distant past. Just as the early post-independence battles about the configuration of states. So remember, right after independence in the 1950s and 60s, the real question was, what are the states? When memories of European control were still fresh, political debates within the Arab world centered on the shape of the post-colonial order. How much of the legacy of European rule would survive. And sovereignty and statehood were the prized symbols of autonomy, authority, and agency in a world that was structured, at least in part, by a global order that reflected the new United Nations. So everybody wanted to be a state, an independent state, a member of the United Nations. And then the question was, what shapes should those states take in the region? So from the 1950s to the 1970s, these questions were debated as the relationship between nations, the Arab nation, the various states that were bequeathed the region by the Europeans, and the governments that controlled those states tried to contest with each other these kinds of questions. So you will all remember this. I don't have to rehearse it, but clearly the toppling of European-imposed monarchs in Egypt, Iraq, and Libya, the wresting of Algeria from France, the creation and dissolution of the United Arab Republic, the repeated and failed efforts to liberate Palestine were all part of that debate about what the states would look like, how big they would be, what they would encompass, who would be ruling there, and so forth. So there was a lot of upheaval about that, and that was a period often characterized as the Arab Cold War. But by the 1970s, that period was essentially over. Efforts to remake the past, and this really was, in some important ways, a backward-looking period, or trying to figure out how much of the past would burden the future. That period was over. The arena of contestation was to move inside states. So no longer did states so much contest with each other or try and come apart and rejoin and reconfigure themselves and so forth. Now the contest, if you will, was domestic, and it was about the stability of the governments, of the regimes. So control of territory was secured, international recognition assured, and regime stability came to take precedence over state building as political priority in the region. And it was in fact a very stable period, particularly compared to the preceding several decades. After decades of military coups, there was no regime change in the Arab world in the 30 years between the oil price rises of 1973 and the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. There were changes of individuals within regimes. If presidents died, vice presidents succeeded. If kings died, sons succeeded, but there was no regime change. So there was a lot of orderly succession, but the regimes themselves were remarkably stable, particularly, as I say, given the preceding years. But this stability obscured a lot of changes in the dynamics of regional politics. And that's what's really important, because during those 30 or so years, a lot of the regimes tried to secure support domestically, less by being accountable than by distributing to clienteles and so forth, such that they would be able to damp down opposition. So state boundaries were largely immovable, regimes seemed similarly secure, but ordinary people grew increasingly vulnerable. And I think this is important. So let me give you two examples, and then I'll begin to move to where we are now. In an odd sort of way, in all of that stability, conflict raged through the region, taking a major toll of human life without discernible impact on any political regimes. So think of the Lebanese Civil War. It cost an estimated 150,000 lives, an exodus of almost 1 million people from the country, but it produced no change in the regime. And indeed, shortly after the war ended, the parliament declared amnesty for all political and wartime crimes. Nothing changed. 150,000 people died and nothing changed. Similarly, after more than 8 years and as many as 1 million casualties, the Iraq-Iran War of the 1980s produced a stalemate. And again, no change in regime. So the global investment in stability, and I will suggest that the Cold War détente was part of that investment in stability, was confirmed, but the human costs of that stability mounted over the course of the decades. So it wasn't just war casualties and refugee counts, and I won't rehearse all of the statistics, but quite clearly, the literacy rate in the Arab world as a whole ended up by now being among the lowest in the world. So the investment in human capital, or what became known as human capital, was not what it should have been during this period. The economy stagnated. The region's share of global exports fell between 1990 and 2008. And in general, the attention to things like education, health, job creation, and so forth was not what one might have hoped. And as a result, or partly in conjunction with that, the Middle East as a whole, the Arab world, grew to be one of the least equal in income and wealth in the whole world. This was a region that was known for its egalitarian policies in the 1950s and 60s. By the end of the century, it was one of the least equal, both across the region and within countries. So clearly, the regime stability was actually masking a deterioration in the living standards of many, many people. And Anthony Cordesman, who is an American analyst based in Washington, said something at the turn of the century that I thought was quite telling. He said, it didn't matter whether the regime was ruled by a king or a sheikh or a president, or it was apparent, he said, that many Middle Eastern states had no enemy greater than their own governments. So this is a pretty shocking thing to say, but when you think about the costs of that kind of stability, that it was masking this deterioration, perhaps that was true. It was certainly in that context that the uprisings around 2011 broke out. And the governments were taken by surprise, in part because they had been not paying as much attention as they might have to the situation of many of their citizens. For a while, they resorted to, by then tired, reliance on some of the old rhetoric about nationalism and so forth. But fairly clearly, many of the efforts to capture popular support by reference to these kinds of old nationalist commitments had been abandoned. So power was no longer measured in the chanting crowds of the 50s and 60s, nor in soldiers under arms. The revolutionary nationalists and patronage dispensing co-religionists were giving way to, and this is where we are now. So now I'm going to talk about, this was the past, this is what the past looked like for the last 50 or 60 years. Now, what is it beginning to look like now? And I think this is interesting and important. Now, the kind of rhetoric of the past and the emphasis on stability in the present is being superseded by claims to own the future. And given the interesting debates that have gone on in the last several days around the new issuing of the report Al-Mustaqbal, which was discussed yesterday, the GAP report, I think it's interesting that we are all focused on the future and how to define the future and what we think it will look like. And that, I think, is being characterized. I'll give you several examples. The ruler of Dubai wrote in his autobiography, and I quote, "Today's leaders are not the same as yesterday's," something with which we would definitely agree. Today's leaders, he said, are the silent giants who possess money, not the politicians who make noise. The babble of politics and its messy entanglements are of little benefit to us in the Arab world. Now, that's really quite a change in rhetoric, at least, that something about what he calls the messy entanglements, the involvement of governments with their people and with the peoples of other countries and so forth, are no longer the way he, in any event, sees the future. And I think in a spectacular indication that neither nationalist pride nor religious allegiance will define the new political landscape, the UAE and Israel signed what was known as the Abraham Accords, a move that opened the door for Israel's normalization of relations with a number of other countries, as you know. Economic cooperation, tourism, foreign investment, especially in technology industries and so forth, soon followed. So we're seeing a different basis for the kinds of alliances that governments are making. What was the logic of this newly emerging regional dynamic? The neoliberal foundations of globalization were presented as a new opportunity to reframe state-society relations, bypassing both states and regimes. The babble of politics was giving way to an entirely new notion of governance. And again, I'll quote the ruler of Dubai, who is a prominent advocate of this new approach to politics. Maybe the time has come for the Gulf Cooperation Council or the Arab League to be overseen by leaders, managers, businessmen, heads of industry, and entrepreneurs instead of foreign ministers. In other words, these are now business enterprises. And the criteria by which the success of the governments is going to be measured are basically the criteria of the market. Obviously, the ruling families of the Gulf are among the most eager proponents of this retreat of the state and the restructuring of regimes. The crown, not only does the ruler of Dubai call himself the CEO of Dubai, but the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has also been called the CEO of Al Saud. So the idea that the way we think about government is actually the way we think about running a business has captured the imagination of a number of the governments in this region. Many of the countries of the region manage sovereign wealth funds. This is an investment mechanism by which they can forego taxing their populations, presumably, and bring in money through investments. Egypt's sovereign wealth fund is the 43rd largest in the world. And you wouldn't necessarily associate Egypt with the sovereign wealth fund in the same way you would Kuwait or the Emirates, but lo and behold, Egypt also has a fund that is investing in projects designed to partner with international private funds and make money. This is a financial strategy. There are other ways of attracting private investment that are proliferating across the region, various kinds of exceptional jurisdictions and privatized enclaves, special economic zones and self-contained techno cities and science parks, all sorts of things that are expected to bring in the kind of financial investments that all of these governments now believe are the key to the future and the key to the prosperity and stability of their governments. This is complicating relations between governments and citizens. Increasingly, the role of the shareholder is beginning to supplement rights-based claims on governments. So this citizen as economic actor may have been born in the Gulf, but it's becoming increasingly adopted throughout the region. Wherever there is foreign investment, there are local partners and agents and representatives looking for shares of the wealth and governments that are prepared to accommodate them. So for those who are the beneficiaries of these arrangements, the rights of citizenship are superseded by the privileges conveyed by patronage and protection in private systems of government, and we're seeing that increasingly. But there are many beneficiaries, ambitious plans for renovating whole cities so that they're easier to work in and easier to accommodate for these kinds of investors are all over the region, and including obviously in Egypt. Now, the visionaries of this understood both sides of the coin they're tendering. They understand that they are privileging a certain class or community, global investors, and they're very optimistic about the fact that this will bring in new revenues, infusions of funding. And I'll quote the ambassador of the UAE to Washington, who says, "What I've watched over the last several years is a shift in mindset, a shift in attitude. Younger people are tired of conflict. They're tired of ideology. They want solutions. They want jobs. They want what every young person around the world wants. We're trying to approach longstanding issues with a completely different lens, going, as he put it, from analog to digital." So there's a lot of optimism, a kind of Silicon Valley techno-optimism about this, that this is really going to save the region and be the source of energy and dynamism in the economy. But the challenge to this is what will happen to those who are outside the enclaves, who are not the beneficiaries of this, as we say, financial inclusion. And of course, as you know, as well as I, there are millions of people across the region in southern Tunisia and in Libya and Yemen and Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere who are left out, who are yet to be beneficiaries of this kind of new business-friendly policy. And so we worry that on the one hand, people are seeing this as an opportunity, are looking with hope to the future, that they will be beneficiaries of this kind of approach of politics as enterprise. And then there are the people who are concerned that they will be, as we say, left behind. Lebanon, I think, suggests a salutary, if disquieting, warning. Lebanon was the country that was most like a business enterprise, particularly after the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction, and the role of Prime Minister Rafik Hariri's construction company in the reconstruction of Beirut is well known. But as the International Crisis Group put it, many of these leaders were mostly serving themselves, and they've amassed considerable wealth in the post-war era. They're talking about Lebanon. In the process, they neglected economic development and helped ruin the country's finances. So the question is whether the new way of doing this, the next generation of the financialization of government, will produce a better outcome, or whether Lebanon's humanitarian catastrophe, which has been kept at bay by remittances sent by millions of Lebanese living abroad, a very private solution to a public calamity, will show us our future. In the absence of governments that see themselves as more than investors, responsible to citizens above shareholders, promoting constituents instead of customers, it is a tantalizing dream for some, but it may be a daunting vision of bleak prospects for those left behind. That, however, is going to be the debate, the conflict of the coming decade, at least, here in the region. And so I think we need to be prepared to have discussions about international finance and what it means for how governments think of their roles vis-a-vis their citizens and vis-a-vis other sources of wealth. So thank you very much.
Lisa, thank you. As always, you've given us a fascinating frame by which to view regional politics. Politics as a business enterprise, to use your frame. It certainly poses an intriguing question that, if taken to its logical conclusion, I mean, if this plays out over the course of the medium term for the region, where does that leave the region? And will this approach actually be able to supersede politics and even supersede the role of religion in politics? So I think the way you framed it raises very interesting questions about the interplay between these factors, business, politics, and religion. So thank you for what I thought was a very insightful essay. Dr. Ibrahimov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karim, and congratulations to you on occasion of the anniversary, 10th anniversary of the Cairo Review, being one of the co-editors. Congratulations to the family, as well for having sponsored and supervised the development of the Cairo Review as a publication of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Lisa Anderson, of course, also had her contribution to the development not only of the journal, but of the school altogether. I'm very glad to share this panel with her, a panel chaired by Dean Fahmy and moderated by you, Karim. In my observations, I will try to be based on this 10th anniversary. I have read the essays, very interesting, and I find that a few essays deal with the state system in the region. Another two deal with the ideational configuration in the system. Nathan Brown talks about religion in politics. Lisa also talks, in fact, about different stages of ideational configurations. And then there are 3 essays on Palestine, the partition of Palestine, and then the 2-state solution. There is a further essay on the environment, which I will leave apart. So I'll try to talk about these three issues. And I will depart from my own essay, even though I will not focus on it. In my essay, I consider that the failure of regionalism in this region is due, to a great extent, to Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism, rather than facilitating regionalism, in fact, stood in the way of regionalism, because there were 2 competing legitimacies. The state system in the region was put into question continuously by Arab nationalists, which in fact undermined these states. These states feared that claims of Arab nationalists would, well, let's say that Arab nationalism would be the basis for putting claims on the resources of these states. So in fact, rather than integrating, they refused integration. The rich countries did not want to share their resources with the poorest among the Arab states. But even before that, Jordan, why Jordan? Syria, why Syria? Lebanon, why Lebanon? So, in fact, you had this contested from the very beginning, from the 1920s. You have this contested legitimacy of the system. Are we in a fragmented system when it should have been one state, as Arab nationalism would claim, or are our states legitimate and they should be given the means of success in their national objectives and aims? The states were reinforced by the rules of the international system. The rules of the international system are those of nation states. So they are, in fact, in conformity with what in the international system is. But within them, there was this idea of these states not being legitimate. You do not find this, for instance, in South America. South America, even though they share the same history, but you do not find Colombia put into question, or Venezuela put into question, or Peru put into question the existence of these states. So, and when they tried to regionalize, the League of Arab States came about, for many, the League of Arab States is a nationalist enterprise. In fact, it is not. The League of Arab States and its charter is very clear. It is about preserving the sovereignty and independence of each state. And you have the League of Arab States acting within an environment denying the legitimacy of its own members. Very difficult for it to advance in this situation. And very difficult to move ahead and to get to regional integration as people now, people regret that this national integration has not, regional integration has not advanced. Why would a nation state, legitimate in the international system, a member of the United Nations, which is very rich, why should it accept sharing its resources with a poor state? Why should a small state in the Gulf, extremely rich, open its labor market to workers from such large countries as Egypt? Why? What exactly in the rationale of nation states would justify that? This, I think, was at the origin of the failure of regionalism and the failure of regional integration in the region. But if you look at other essays, like Paul Salem, for instance, you find that Paul also is saying that the regional system is at the origin of the conflicts that later we witnessed. In fact, starting in the 1950s, in the 1970s, it's all Syria intervenes, the deterrence forces intervene in 1976 in the name of Arab, but Syria does not recognize Lebanon. So you have a real problem here in the foundations of the system itself. Add to that these states, in fact, and here Arab nationalists may have some justification in their thoughts. These states lack also many attributes of states. In fact, their resources were divided, fragmented. They could not advance in the process of development. Add to that Israel came to also multiply their problem. So there is here a problem that needs to be addressed. I turn to my second part of my observations, which are regarding the ideational configuration of the system. Lisa pointed out the huge problem that we have: inequality, employment question, highest levels of unemployment, of youth unemployment in the world in particular, poverty, lack of development overall, except for the very small countries in the Gulf. Real problems here. And Lisa ends up with the idea after reviewing different stages, Arab nationalism, Islamism, and she comes to this idea of, she deals with the concept of polity as an enterprise. Polity as an enterprise at a time after several decades of neoliberal policies in the region. Neoliberal policies which reduced the functions carried out by the states in the region and end up, as she said, in the political system envisioned as an enterprise. Now, I have this question to her. isn't polity as an enterprise the logical conclusion of neoliberal policies? Now, the problem is that I think that Emmanuel Macron in France would like to have France managed as an enterprise. Donald Trump also thought, the problem is for them is that you have structured political societies. In France, Emmanuel Macron cannot rule France as an enterprise. Donald Trump cannot rule the United States as an enterprise. In very small states where you don't have real societies, as Margaret Thatcher said in the early 80s, you probably can do that. But can you do that in Arab countries with large populations? So, question of polity as an enterprise, yes, with some conditions. But in other conditions, I don't see it as a possibility. I don't see it as a possibility because you have resistance, you have pushback by societies. And this means that politics will not disappear because politics in enterprises disappear. You have shareholders and you don't have conflict over distribution of resources, which is politics, it's about distribution of resources. So you don't have this in enterprise. But will you not have this, as we heard yesterday, in the session yesterday in Algeria? Will you not have this in Iraq? Will you not have this in Egypt? So, in fact, the same drive to consider politics as an enterprise, I think, is, to me, a failed idea. I don't think that it will carry the day. Now, I get to the future of the region. I think I agree with what you said. May I just add that for some, the lingering problems in the region should be set aside. If you cannot solve the Palestinian question, let's forget about it, because an enterprise cannot be bothered by such a problem. Let's forget about it. So and let's get into agreements, as you said, in business agreements. Is this possible? Can you build a region with a lingering problem of Palestinians? And the Palestinians, by the way, the birth rates are very high. Palestinians are not close to disappear. They are there, and they are increasing in number, even within Israel, within Israel and Palestine together. So how can you ignore that? So a state system for the future will have to address these problems. We'll have to address the socioeconomic issues of inequality, of illiteracy. You have very high literacy rates in many Arab countries. You will have to address the question of gender. But you cannot forget the question of Palestine. It's at the heart of the region. And then a state system for the future also should address problems that it ignored since the 1920s. For instance, the Kurdish question, the minorities questions, not addressed, as if by forgetting them, they are solved. But in fact, a region around the Arab countries will have to open up to the reality of the existence of Turkey and Iran, parts of the history and the geography of the region. And then you cannot ignore Israel, because Israel negatively or positively influences the region. But in this case, if you have Turkey and Iran, how can you forget the Kurdish question? So this is, how can you forget the question of the religious minorities in the region? I, for one, would like to have the one citizen, one vote, of course, the equality, but this needs policies. It's not by having a norm or a rule that we have solved the problem. The problem needs policies and institutions to be put in place in order to guarantee that there is equality between citizens of the different nations. So you have to address question of minorities, you have to address socioeconomic issues. But first, I think we discussed yesterday, and I had a problem all last 2 weeks, because I couldn't differentiate between the sessions of yesterday and today. I couldn't, and I said this several times, Karim, because in fact, what we discussed yesterday is very important. But the issue here is that we need to imagine and to agree on rules for building the system and for addressing these issues. Because these issues are fine. These issues are fine that we identify. But there is a political dimension to that, how to go about them. And I think this is, I think you ended up your intervention with what would be the politics of what would be the substance of politics in the next 10 years. I agree with what you said, and I add that the problem will remain the same. Remain the same, which is agreeing on rules that will allow each and every country with sovereignty recognized and legitimacy recognized, and then to progressively dismantle this sovereignty in the interest of integration in the region. But first, we need to agree on rules for each country to govern itself, and then for the region to be built together. And as was said yesterday, the reconstruction of the region could be an opportunity for doing that. I remember having a conversation like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, with the Secretary General or Executive Secretary of the East African Community. And he said to me at that time, that in fact, the East African Community is a way of overcoming the artificial divisions of the member states of the East African Community. At that time, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, only the new ones had them. So I think that we can overcome the problems that originated in the artificial political units in the region by going to re-integrate. But this will require first agreement within each and every country and the respect of the sovereignty, of the legitimacy of each country. Again, questions, socioeconomic questions come first, but at the same time, the structures, the political structures have to be put in place, and policies need to be formulated and implemented. Rules only and structures only are not sufficient. The functions and how these are carried out is very, very important. Thank you very much.
Dr. Awad, thank you. You've complemented, I think, the presentation given by Dr. Anderson very well. And you've also raised an overarching question about regional order. And you've explained to us very well how the regional order seems to be conducive to conflicts, both among states and also within states. And I think you've outlined a vision for how the regional order can be reformed. But of course, much more needs to be said about how that should be accomplished. So I have the very easy task of bringing all of these questions to Dean Fahmy, and he, of course, has the much more challenging task of addressing them. Dean Fahmy.
Two excellent presentations, very difficult to follow. And therefore, let me try to complement them rather than follow them with two bookends, one of them being my practitioner experience and the other one being my experience as an educator. Different contexts, but at the end of the day, I think they're useful, and in many ways, both Dr. Anderson and Dr. Awad shared some of those points. But I'm going to really focus on what I think one assumed you were trying to achieve in 2011 when we started as a community, and in the region and the world in general back in 2011, and where we are today. And let me start by saying, I remember, I think it's in the first edition, at the time I wrote an article entitled 100 yards from Tahrir Square. And I think it's in the first edition, if not, it's in the second one. And the idea was, I actually used to live 2 minutes away from here. And I could literally smell and hear what was happening in Tahrir Square the end of January, beginning of February, 24 hours a day. You could sense the dreams, the aspirations that existed in the square. You could sense also the challenges that were about to emerge. And what we couldn't sense at the time was how this is really going to turn out. But in sharing my comments on these 2 points, what were the aspirations and where are we today? I just wanted to provide a small anecdote that gives you some context. For my country, Egypt, from 1952 to 2011, 69 years, we had 4 presidents. From 2011 to 2014, 3 years, we had 4 presidents. That in itself shows you the magnitude of the aspirations. It also shows you the challenges that we were about to face. There is no question in my mind that the dreams of Tahrir Square, and the same, frankly, applies throughout the Arab world in many respects, where you had changes that were physical, sudden, and even in other countries that did not have sudden changes, and I'll get to that in a second. People wanted a better livelihood, but they also wanted to share in the system of governance. They wanted to have a role in moving forward. But again, the reason I mentioned the anecdote was to tie the dreams to the challenges. I think the real question isn't, did we fulfill the dreams? Because that was almost impossible. You cannot fulfill those kinds of dreams after that kind of context in 10 years. It's almost impossible. The question really is, how much progress did we achieve, and where do we need to add to that? So I would really try to complement, or if you want, caveat the question of not what did we achieve, but how much, whether we achieve, but how much. I would add here that among the complexities, and I only mentioned my own country, but the same applies, frankly, throughout the Arab world, and in some occasions in the Middle East, but mostly the Arab world. The Arab world faces 2 fundamental deficiencies. One, there has been a generic resistance to incremental change. And I'm not talking only politics. We have a saying, what you know is better than what you don't know. I have no idea why. That we would always be worried about what we don't know, and we'd assume it's worse than what we do know, even if we're not satisfied in what we are. But this is, again, it has nothing to do, let me rephrase that. It's not only an issue of politics, but it is, if you want, a culture that has been ingrained in us over the years. And the only definite that is without question is change will happen. If it's not, doesn't happen incrementally, it will happen suddenly in a more in a more sudden fashion, and consequently a more problematic fashion. The second issue that relates to the Middle East and Arab versus non-Arab countries is there is a national security deficiency on the Arab side vis-a-vis the non-Arab members of the Middle East, mostly because Arabs from the Atlantic right through North Africa to the Levant and then down to the Gulf have always over-depended on foreigners, and then occasionally even on other regional parties for their national security capacity. Many of us actually changed from one superpower to the other over that year. But in essence, because the Arabs tended to depend on foreigners, they didn't really build their own national security capacity. I'm not talking only about military hardware, also the politics. While other regional states in the Middle East, non-Arab, had alliance relationships with others, but actually built their own capacity. And you saw this imbalance factor in during the last decade, so that the Arab world was facing domestic change and a regional change in the paradigm at the same time. Now, catalytic factors to this, why, and I've been asked repeatedly by my international friends, why did things happen so chaotically in your part of the world while change happened in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth? Well, for one reason, there's no one answer, but one reason is the youth factor. 65% of the Arab world is less than 30 years old. That's a definition, that's an element that clearly calls for change, and it's an impatient call for change. At the same time, if the institutions of government don't want change, and youth is the majority and want change, you're obviously going to have a sudden eruption. With youth, you have tremendous dreams, but you have very little experience. So the ability of youth to take Tahrir and transform that into efficient governance is not something that one can expect or blame them for, because there was a 70-year period, and much so in the Arab world, of a lack of efficient politics. Let me add also the sudden change in the Arab world happened in almost all of the traditionally backbones of the Arab system. They happened in Egypt, they happened in Iraq, also happened in Syria, and here I'm mentioning where governments were actually changed. But if you extend that to Saudi Arabia, what's happening in the Gulf, what's happening in Algeria, all of them, some are facing governmental change, others, frankly, are facing societal change. There's no question that the points I mentioned earlier were the force behind the change in the social, if you want, the social messages in Saudi Arabia, even though the ruling family remains the same. So the idea that change is only happening in the republics and in those that I mentioned is simply not true. It's being pushed throughout the region for the reasons I mentioned, the deficiencies and the demographic composition. And I would add to it technology. You cannot live in isolation any longer. You are affected by what happens around you. And at the same time, your aspirations are those in comparison to what others have achieved throughout. Again, a simple example, and I'll use myself as, if you want, admit my own mistake here. I was asked just before 2011, after Tunis happened, whether it would happen in Egypt suddenly. And my knee-jerk reaction was, they're not the same. That was actually correct, but the message wasn't correct. There's no comparison in the complexity that exists in Egypt vis-a-vis Tunis, their advantages, our advantages, disadvantages, and so on and so forth. But the reality is, what happened in Tunis did have resonance in our part of the world, in Egypt. And what happened in Egypt had resonance throughout the rest of the Arab world again, including where no physical change of government occurred, but it drove the institutions of government throughout the Arab world to look at things differently. I mentioned Saudi Arabia a few minutes ago. If you add to that, for example, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, throughout the Arab world, leaders are more and more talking about the future rather than only the history and the past. Everybody today is trying to appear, if not to truly try. Some are truly trying, others are simply trying to appear to be trying to build a better future for their people. And that's a reflection that even in an imperfect situation, they feel accountable to their people. That's the function of the factors I mentioned, but also technology in particular. A point to add here, the accountability and the change, success or failure, I think will vary depending on what we're talking about in particular. But one general point to make before getting into the balance sheet a little bit. The world generally, not only in the Arab world, one of the successes of the Western model is the world as a whole has become a market. And therefore, whether you were former communist countries or developing countries like my own, left, right, and center, the overwhelming majority of states are much more materialistic in their assessment than they were in the past. I had the opportunity to meet President Putin years back, and I had met President Biden as a senator many times. But I can tell you, 1 hour discussion with Putin, he did not talk about ideology once. It was all about concrete evidence of success. Even in my country today, and this is legitimate because we had so much to make up, there's a very strong focus in building material assets, and proving that we have achieved hard asset success. Dr. Anderson's comments are really rich in many, many respects. And I understand the issue of polity becoming an enterprise. I'd caveat a little bit to where Ibrahim was, although not completely, but close to that. Everybody's more materialistic, so that really falls into what Lisa was saying. But I do share the point raised by Ibrahim that when you're dealing with the common good, you want to be as efficient as a corporate private sector, but it cannot only be profit and loss. It has to have a focal point as the focal point has to be the social contract between the governors and those being governed. And I think Hud Rashad yesterday made the point quite clearly that progress, development, and so forth isn't only about numbers. It's also about people feeling satisfied that they're being treated fairly in comparison to their peers. Add to that my peers were my neighbors. The peers of my kids are international. They don't relate only to those around them. And 2 of my 3 kids got their jobs on the internet. So again, technology is an important point here. So I do believe we're trying to corporatize in terms of efficiency, but I don't think that it's going to be ever possible, nor healthy, frankly, if we simply try to look at issues of the common good only in terms of profit and loss, because there are issues that cannot be dealt with in that fashion. What I see as positive from looking at the last 10 years, there's no question that the Arab world had underperformed in most of the different disciplines that we talked about, and that the Arab leaders understand today that they need to do better. So the fact that they need to address challenges more efficiently, I think, is a good point. I think it's also evident that it's not about having a high percentage GDP versus other countries, but it's also about ensuring that the wealth, the distribution of wealth reaches as much of your society as is possible. So there really needs to be a refinement of the social contract in many of the countries in the Arab world. Another positive element is, as I said, whether they did it by intention or as a result of past experiences, the Arab world is tending to look forward now rather than backward. I'm not arguing that one should ignore rights or historical context, but my argument is one needs to build looking forward without ignoring past realities, but not try to rebuild the past or simply stop at points of achievement in the past, because they will definitely change. I think it's also positive that most of our societies today want to hold their governments accountable and want to share in moving forward. Now, it hasn't been a tremendous success the last decade, and I said at the beginning, it could not really be a tremendous success given that we spent a long time without serious polity. But it could be much better than where we are today. I still believe that transparent, accountable governance has a way to go in the Middle East and in the Arab world. I still believe that shared governance has a way to go in the Arab world and the Middle East. I still believe that developing a social contract that encourages the private sector, encourages the generation of wealth, but also ensures I don't want to use the word equitable, but a fair distribution of wealth has a way to go in the Arab world, in the Middle East. Without any hesitation, I still believe that political systems in the Arab world need to be refined and energized to be able to deal with these points I just mentioned. That's what they're supposed to be doing. Yesterday, Dr. Awad and I were asked in a press conference about the Al-Mustaqbal report. And the criticism or the question was, okay, you guys wrote something up that sounds interesting. How are you going to implement it? And we both answered, it's not for us to implement it, but it is our role as, for lack of a better term, intellectuals or analysts to try to develop ideas and systems and recommendations that should feed into political systems where politicians, officials then pick and choose from what is being offered, and then those in government take it to a higher level and decide on what has to be done. So I would again argue that political systems need to be energized. It has to be a system that is inclusive, with a greater sense of decentralization, but at the same time, a structured system to make it efficient. We're not looking at, I don't believe that the region can survive a lot more chaos, nor is that something we should be look forward to. The third, or the fourth or fifth point, I do believe that in each of our countries, we need to look much better at how to ensure a better distribution of income throughout the systems. I'm going to close with just one word that or one point that I've been talking about in different contexts for the last couple of months. The Middle East is changing. Whether we like it or not, it's changing. And without dismantling institutions that exist today, because I think they can be useful, I do believe we need to realize that the world community is changing. What you saw in Ukraine, just one example. The emergence of China is another. But our own region is changing as well. Some of the changes were mentioned by the previous two speakers. Therefore, the Arab world needs to engage more positively in developing a more robust, a more realistic, a more regional orientation for its Middle East. In other words, a Middle East security architecture that reflects where we want to go rather than what existed in the past. And I use the word architecture, although I actually took it from Ramzi a while ago. I use it because it's a process of drawing up a system. I don't have the drawings yet. It has to come up from the evolution itself. And I would argue that it has to be a system that is consistent with international law, because we are all medium-sized states. Secondly, it's a system that should have a set of guidelines that are established through dialogue by the region. And then within that context, you would have a series of measures, whether they relate to a conflict resolution channel and or conflict resolution and security channel, and or a socioeconomic channel on the other side, because ultimately these issues cannot be separated in the long term. In creating this system, this is a two-decade project, it would have to start from within our own states. What you ask others to apply, you will have to apply yourself domestically in that context of domestic relations. But secondly, it would also involve bilateral arrangements, sub-regional arrangements, and then also regional arrangement. But I really want to conclude by saying a lot of work has to be done in the Arab world and in the Middle East. What you saw 10 years ago here was an expression of aspiration, dreams, and interest. Yes, people can argue that they haven't been fulfilled, but there has been some progress. But we have a road and a way to go still. And I think it is achievable, especially if we open enough space to the youth that are today the the majority of our population. Thank you very much. Thank you, Karim.
Thank you, Dean Fahmy. You've given us much more food for thought than was actually delivered, or in addition to what was delivered by our two panelists. So allow me very quickly to get to the discussion period. We have a number of questions from the chat, which I would like to pose to our panelists, but I would also invite those of you who are with us in person to also, if you wish, pose questions and comments to our panelists. Let me just start with a question that I think would really benefit from each of your perspectives. And that touches on the issue of youth, which Dean Fahmy mentioned quite starkly in his comments. And the question arises, as was put by one of our participants from the chat, is what does the youth want? Speaking from personal experience, having moved into academia, one really gets the sense of the difficulty of answering this question because of the very wide gap, generational gap, that seems to be, in fact, getting bigger. The gap between my generation and that of my students is, I think, quite considerable. So the difference in outlook, the difference in worldviews, the difference in aspirations is very difficult to address, even to identify. So that is one question that I would pose to the group. It's a general question. The second question is much more specific. We have a number of questions that keep coming up quite frequently about the issue of water. Now, water, of course, is not a new issue, but it seems to be a much more pressing one. And I would reframe the question to our panelists as one of resource governance, because it's not just water, it's energy, it's food, and the nexus between these three resources. Perhaps I could pose that specifically to Dr. Ibrahim, but also anybody else from the panel who would like to address that. Let me take these two questions back to our panelists. Dr. Ibrahim, starting with you.
I'll take up your two questions, Karim. When you ask what does youth want, you know, youth is not a monolithic block. There are youth who are extremely well educated, with financial and social capital. And then you have youth who are very poorly educated to non-educated at all. And these have different attitudes and different aspirations and different projects for their lives. So I think the analysis should break down this youth, and break down this youth along socio-economic backgrounds and also along gender lines. I would think that, yes, the youth that is very well educated with social and financial capital wants to integrate in the global class of their peers, where differences are not that pronounced, less and less pronounced than they used to be previously in this times of globalization. But these are minorities, Karim. These are minorities, and the very large majority of youth in our countries are underprivileged. And these are the youth that should be our main concern. The other youngsters, they can care for themselves. And this really is the problem and the development that we look for. Development should be geared at meeting the needs and improving the lives of these young populations, which will be the adults of tomorrow. These should be the ones that exercise pressures for the formulation of policy. Again, development should be geared at these. Your second question about water, in fact, this is something that I deal with in the essay in the Cairo review. I point out to the weak basis of integration if it were considered from a trade perspective. Trade perspective in countries with similar production structures will not take you very far in integration. In fact, you have to produce and exchange in sectors where the majority or where all the participants in the integration projects could draw benefits. Water is one of them because 18 countries out of 22 Arab countries are water poor. 10 countries are extremely water poor. So there are benefits for them to. And then, of course, in renewable energy. And renewable energy and water influence each other. And finally, of course, the environment. All of these are good sectors where you can imagine integration. Now, where will you get this water? And I think that this will militate for a larger regional integration than that of Arab countries alone, because Turkey is a source of water, is an extremely rich source of water in the region, but I will not get into the details of how we will go about that, but certainly these are sectors where integration should be pushed for.
Thank you. Lisa?
I think I have less to say about resources. I do think we need to be taking far more seriously globally and in this region the challenges of environmental constraints of various kinds. And so water is one of them, but there are lots of challenges that will have, among other things, political consequences if we don't manage them properly. But I would like to say, and in this also agree with Ibrahim here, I think the category of youth is sort of a red herring. I think it's a distraction at this point. The problems are really people who are poor, people who are ill-educated, people who are sick, who are, and those are the kinds of categories we need to be thinking about. Most of the people we're talking about are young, just because, as the dean said, most people are young. But I don't think we need to characterize them by age, in a sense. I haven't in my lifetime seen a generation that didn't say, I don't understand kids today. I mean, that's sort of, we all say that. Nobody understood the kids in the 60s, that's not really the point. The point is, are the young people being prepared for a life that's a reasonable life? Are they being educated? Are they, so I think we should sort of move aside the youth issue and start talking about what kinds of services do people need? Are they being adequately educated, and so forth and so on.
Thank you. Dean Fahmy.
Almost exactly what Lisa just said. I say this from my own experience with my children and frankly grandchildren, but also as Dean of the School of Global Affairs, I find that we are trying to teach the students global affairs that by the time we finish teaching them will have changed. So it's more about providing the systems for them to deal with these challenges in the future and helping them understand how to think rather than what to think. I honestly believe, and this is why I agree with Lisa and with Ibrahim, systems of governance have to create processes that allow their constituents to engage. People will engage at different levels for different things, and these will change. There are, of course, the minimum requirements that governments have to provide. Health is just one example of that. But it's a question that appears simple, but I think, frankly, the problem isn't that it's simple. It's simply an inefficient question. It's really, how do we create systems for the youth to decide what they decide as their priority and how they move forward? And you cannot deal with youth separately from dealing with gender issues or dealing with issues of more mature old age people.
Thank you. There's what I think is a very pertinent question posed by one of our online participants about Palestine. And the question specifically addresses or asks about the implications of the Abraham Accords for the Palestinian issue. But I would just try and frame this in a broader context. The issue of Palestine featured very prominently in our first Cairo Review issue 10 years ago, and it features very prominently in our 10th anniversary issue. And while 10 years ago there was a modest sense of optimism that the political openings might provide a pathway for the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, today the prospects are much less optimistic. And the essays that we have in our 10th anniversary issue talk about the erosion of the two-state solution. And while the mainstream view that I think was expressed by Dr. Ibrahim was that you cannot forget about the Palestinian issue, I think the sentiment today is that this is no longer a central concern for the region. There are other conflicts. We have Syria, we have Yemen, we have Libya, we have Lebanon, we have the challenge posed by regional states, Iran, Turkey, so on. So what is the outlook for what we thought of as once being a very central core issue for the region and the regional order? Perhaps I could start from the reverse order this time and call on Dean Fahmy to address this first.
Countries, governments are driven towards political compromise, either by security concerns or by economic concerns. That's really what drives them. When there weren't any agreements between Arabs and Israelis, the military option was a possibility. And there was a cap, if you would like, on the potential for economic growth. For those reasons, there was a push and pull of, do we move towards a negotiated solution? Is it a comprehensive one, a state-by-state situation, and so on and so forth? And as one state after the other from the neighboring states established peace agreements, needless to say, the threat vis-a-vis Israel decreased. Therefore, their potential to reach agreements with their core adversary, the core adversary here are the Palestinians, because they're both looking for national identity on a small piece of land. The core adversary is not, at least ideologically, Egypt, Jordan, Syria. It's really about, who do I share the land with, or how do I share it with two identities at the same time? If you look at the Abraham Accords, there's clearly a reflection of what was said previously. Not only will they have a reflection on the Palestinian message that all the Arabs want the same thing, but they're also a reflection that even in the Arab states, they want to move on a bit. I don't think that by moving on, they're moving away from Palestinian rights, but there's clearly a sense of not wanting to sacrifice more if there's no prospects for moving forward. Now, the reason I say this is the following. They are a reality, and I've told my Palestinian friends, I understand your concern. There's no question that you would have preferred the Beirut summit formula, but decisions have been taken in that respect. So focus on the real problem rather than on the fact that there are some Arabs who chose another direction. And the real problem, with all candidness, is not essentially the divisions between Palestinians. The real problem, in my mind, if we're looking at a two-state solution, is Israel does not see in its interest to establish a two-state solution. The present Israeli government brings in the extreme right and the extreme left. There's no way they can reach an agreement on a two-state solution. And the alternative to that is actually Netanyahu has a stronger popularity today than any of the leaders of this government. So the alternative is even worse. Nobody in Israel today of strong enough influence actually wants to have a two-state solution. Now, just to close this angle, while I'm pessimistic about two-state solution, it's too early to rule out that this issue could once again become if you want, a regional priority. It will always be a regional issue. Let me explain that by saying the following. Violent outbreaks in Jerusalem would immediately be the cause of a serious gathering of the Arab public. Not as it was in the past, but definitely much more than the complacency which we see today. And I would argue, I think, a peaceful resistance by Palestinians in the occupied territories and in Israel itself would also generate considerable support. Do I think that's enough to establish a two-state solution? I think day by day, the probability of that is decreasing, but I don't see a solution beyond that. A one-state solution means both of them lose their identity. So I'm not exactly sure. It may be a reality, but I'm not sure if that's going to be a solution.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson?
I am going to extend my cynical approach to polities as enterprises, and I would include at this point Israel as basically a business operation. The Abraham Accords is a business deal with people who are interested in actually business. Commercial, if you will. Both the Israelis and particularly the small Gulf countries with which they have made these agreements see most of the people who live in their domains as employees. And so the Palestinians are being conceptualized as employees, and therefore the issue of rights becomes less and less central to the debate. I don't think that, so I'm being cynical about this in the sense of, I think this is a way to understand what the way the Israelis are thinking about it, and for that matter, the way their counterparts are thinking about their own populations and the relationship with Israel. I think, I'd like to go back to something that Ibrahim said earlier. I think it's a very unlikely prospect that this is going to work. In other words, there is going to be pushback. All the people who are being left behind in this business conception of government are not prepared to be left behind. So that is going to be the poor people in many countries. It's going to be the Palestinians who are being left. or, the idea that you can actually leave everyone behind and just say, we're going to make so much money that it's not going to matter. I don't think that's going to work, but I think in order to be able to sort of, if you will, conceptualize and manage how the pushback happens, I think we have to understand what you're pushing against. And I think that's why what I'm trying to argue, I think, is important. If you think of the rulers as thinking of themselves as business people, then how do you interact with them in a way that makes the pushback not just flash mobs of anger, but actually constructive approaches to saying there is a common good, there is a public responsibility. These are things that you cannot avoid simply because you've reconceptualized how government's supposed to work. So in that sense, I think the Palestinians are a part of that larger picture.
Thank you. Dr. Awad, quick thoughts?
I agree with what Lisa just said and with what Nabil said previously. I think you said at the beginning that there are so many problems. So I mean, it's not only the Palestinian now. You have the Syrian, you have the Yemeni, you have the Libyan. But in reality, this does not mean that you should prioritize crises or problems. All of them exist, and all of them will need to be addressed. The problem in this region is that no issue is being addressed. No problem is being addressed. Yesterday, we heard the presentation by Ambassador Ramzi. No one can address the Syrian situation, the Libyan situation, the Yemeni situation, but the Palestinian situation is probably at the heart of all these situations. How can you distinguish this Palestinian question from what happens in Syria? How can you do that? And assume that you ignore Palestinian. Assume that the enterprise ignores the Palestinian question. What will happen when the Palestinians rise up in the West Bank? What will happen? Will you condone a repression of the Palestinians? Will you condone the repression of millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza? It will be extremely difficult. It's almost impossible. As you said, 10 years ago, it was a subject of the first issue. And 10 years later, it's still, you cannot ignore it. And I think that the Palestinians, and here I want to build on what Lisa just said. The Palestinians need to think, and in fact, they have already started thinking, of addressing the question not within the region only, in the world. In the world. The great support coming to the Palestinian question now comes from the world and not from the region. In fact, we have seen several months ago how intellectuals, how academics have come up in support, how artists have come out in support. They should work with that. And this, in a globalized world, will have its impact on the region. So I think that I do not know how this will play out. I cannot imagine how this will play out. But I think there are ways, approaches to be tried, and I think they will be tried. I think they will be tried.
Thank you. We are already over time for this session. So I think we have time for one final question, and I will give the microphone to Ambassador Ramzi, with my apologies to others in the audience who wanted to pose questions. But Ambassador Ramzi, if you, here, let me, please, if you could pose the question briefly.
It concerns what Dr. Anderson said about governance as a business enterprise. And I'll take my cue from what both Ibrahim and Nabil said. I can see that as a model in countries with a financial surplus, small population. It's possible. Not entirely, but it might be possible. But in countries with larger populations, with no financial surpluses, with enormous economic and political and social problems, that might not work very much, might not. What I see now is that the latter, have been gravitating towards Chinese-Russian model, political autocracy, free enterprise with government still plays a very important role. Do you see that also, or do you see them choosing a different model? The countries with large populations, no financial surplus, where are they heading in our part of the world?
Dr. Anderson.
I do think the small countries can afford this experiment and obviously are affording this experiment. What I think is interesting is the extent to which they are influencing the rhetoric and to some extent the policy of other countries in the region and in their circles, if you will. And so over the course of time, I think you're right that the larger countries will begin to emulate China. That's a plausible alternative model to the one that I described. But I think one of the things to be alert to, and this is why I think we need to be alert to, because I don't think, particularly in the large countries, this is going to work. So rather than just have everyone sort of run headlong saying, well, the answer to everything is entrepreneurship. And, basically all the young people can become entrepreneurs and that's the solution to our problem. It's not the solution to the problem. Financial inclusion, which sounds so wonderful, is actually for people who are not prepared and educated, a recipe for debt that is not the solution. So you begin to say, what are the responsibilities of the government to make sure that there is an environment in which entrepreneurship makes sense? It's not just the sort of automatic blame the victim. If you didn't succeed, it's not my problem. And in that sense, I think the Chinese have been fairly successful in saying there is a context in which these kinds of things can work, rather than simply say, that's the private sector is going to solve our problems. So the temptation on the part of any of these governments at this point to sort of say, well, the private sector is the solution. And they've had decades of encouragement in that direction, as we've already established. I think the issue now is to say, if you don't want to be Lebanon, you better start thinking now about what the responsibilities of the public sector should be, even in a context that is very private sector friendly. And I don't think there's as much of that back talk and conversation and dialogue as there might be. That would be very fruitful. So I don't, that's sort of where I'm hoping this conversation goes. Recognizing that there is a temptation, and more of a temptation when you're rich and small, to simply say, we're just going to be a holding company of businesses. You can't do that here. You couldn't do it in most of the region. But then what are the ways that you take some of what's of value there and provide and this gets to youth, if you will. You have to educate people to make those kinds of possibilities real. So what is the kind of educational system that will provide that basis, the floor on which the platform for success as entrepreneurs, for example? So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to be returning to. And that's the rationale for returning to them in the 21st century.
Dr. Ibrahim, you may have the last word on this panel, I think.
Just some words in reply to Ramzi. Question is, I particularly am not very sort of fond of the Chinese system. But to say that the alternative to a liberal democracy, pluralist democracy, is authoritarianism. There are authoritarianism and authoritarianisms. The Chinese system is quite sophisticated. It's quite a complex system. So it's not sufficient to say authoritarian. No, there is a system here that resulted in development.
Oh, exactly.
That resulted in,
That was the point.
this is the issue.
Yes,
Huh?
it is.
So it's not about authority. No, they have a system of policy making and institutions to put in place to implement the policies. And you know, in China, there is inequality now, but they are keen on improving standards of living of the population in general. So with increasing inequality, still those who are at the bottom improve their standards of living. So there are.
I would like to suggest that you put on your agenda for a dialogue authoritarianism and different kinds. And I teach a course called that, and I would love, because it's true. I mean, these are important distinctions and subtleties in how you understand the role of government. And I think there is actually quite a lot of experimentation in the world. What I described as one experiment, which I do think there needs to be a conversation about the viability of that experiment, just as there should be a conversation about the viability of a Chinese experiment or Singapore or any of the other alternatives.
Thank you, Lisa. We will take you up on that suggestion if you promise to come back and lead our discussion. So at the end of this, what I thought was a very insightful conversation, I would really like to extend my sincere thanks to each of our panelists for highlighting the many and complex and diverse themes that were featured in our special issue of the Cairo Review. Before bringing it to a close, I would also like to thank the participants, those of you who joined us today in person, and for our online participants who joined us via Zoom. I would be remiss without thanking a number of people at the Cairo Review. First of all, my co-editor, Firas Atrakshi, who could not be with us this evening, which is regrettable because he is really the mainstay of the Cairo Review. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank him in person. Our fabulous editorial team at the Cairo Review, they also could not be here because they are actually preparing for our next issue, our spring issue, which is due to come out in a few weeks. They do an excellent job of putting out the quarterly and maintaining the standards that we try and keep for the journal as a whole. And finally, the gentleman who started the Cairo Review 10 years ago, our predecessor as editor, Mr. Scott Macleod. Scott Macleod came to AUC after a very long and distinguished journalist career as the bureau chief for Time magazine in the Middle East. He single-handedly started the Cairo Review. He's the one that really set the standards of quality and excellence for this journal. And Dean Fahmy reached out to him 10 years ago, and Lisa was present also at the creation. So I really want to take this opportunity to thank him as well. And with that, thank you all for being here and look forward to the next Tahrir dialogue. Thank you.